Chapter 18 of The Mystery of Angelina Frood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Mystery of Angelina Frood by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 18. The Uncontrite Penitent. As the door closed on Angelina, a buzz of excited talk broke out. The astonished jurymen put their heads together and eagerly discussed the new turn of events, while the coroner sat with a deeply cogitative expression, evidently thinking hard and casting an occasional speculative glance in Thorndyke's direction. Meanwhile, Cobbledick edged up to my side and presented his views in a soft undertone. "This is a facer, Doctor, isn't it? Regular do. My word, just think of the artfulness of that young woman, toting us round and helping us to find the things that she had just popped down for us to find. I call it a masterpiece." He chuckled admiringly and added in a lower tone, "I hope she hasn't got herself into any kind of mess." I looked at Cobbledick with a renewed appreciation. I had always liked the sergeant. He was a capable man and a kindly one. And now he was showing a largeness of soul that won my respect and my gratitude too. A small man would have been furious with Angelina, but Cobbledick took her performance in a proper sporting spirit. He was only amused and admiring. Not for nothing had nature imprinted on his face that benevolent smile. Presently Mr. Pilly, who seemed to have a special gift for the expression of erroneous opinions, addressed himself to the coroner. "Well, Mr. Chairman," he said cheerfully, "I suppose we can consider the inquest practically over?" "Over?" exclaimed the astonished coroner. "Yes. We are inquiring into the death of Angelina Frood. But if Mrs. Frood is alive after all, why there is an end to the matter." "What about the body in the mortuary?" demanded the foreman. Said Pelly. "I had forgotten about that." He looked owlishly at the coroner and then exclaimed, "But that is the body of Mrs. Frood." "It can't be if Mrs. Frood is alive," the coroner reminded him. "But it must be," persisted Pelly. "It has been identified as her, and it had her clothes and rings on it. Mr. Bundy must have been pulling her legs." "There is certainly something very mysterious about that body," said the coroner. "It was dressed in Mrs. Frood's clothes, as Mr. Pilly points out, and it appears that Mrs. Frood must be in some way connected with it." "There is no doubt about that," agreed the foreman. "She must know who that dead person is, and how the body came to be in the place where it was found, and she'll have to give an account of it." "Yes," said the coroner, "but it is a mysterious affair. I wonder if Dr. Thorndyke could enlighten us. He seems to know more about the matter than anybody else." But Thorndyke was not to be drawn into any statement. "It would merely be a conjecture on my part," he said. "Presumably Mrs. Frood knows how the remains got into the wall, and I must leave her to give the necessary explanations." "I don't see what explanations she can give," said the foreman. "It looks like a clear case of willful murder, and it is against her." To this view the coroner gave a guarded assent. And indeed it was the obvious view. There was a body in Angelina's clothing, and everything pointed clearly to Angelina's complicity in the crime, if there had really been a crime committed. And what other explanation was possible? As I reflected on the foreman's ominous words, I was sensible of a growing alarm. What if Angelina had been, as it were, snatched from the grave, only to be placed in the dock on a charge of murder? That she could possibly be guilty of a crime did not enter my mind. But there was evidently some sort of criminal entanglement from which she might find it hard to escape. The appearances were sinister in the extreme. Her simulated disappearance, her disguise, her suspicious silence during the inquiry. To any eye but mine, they were conclusive evidence of her guilt. And the more I thought about it, the more deadly did the sum of that evidence appear, until, as the time ran on, I became positively sick with terror. The opening of a door and a sudden murmur of surprise caused me to turn, and there was Angelina herself. But not quite the Angelina that I remembered. Gone were the pallid complexion, the weary, dark-circled eyes, the downcast mouth, the sad and pensive countenance, the dark, strong eyebrows. Rosy-cheeked, smiling, confident, and looking strangely tall and imposing, she stepped composedly over to the head of the table and stood there gazing with calm self-possession and the trace of a smile at the stupefied juryman. "Your name is?" said the coroner, gazing at her in astonishment. "Angelina Frood," was a quiet reply, and the voice was Bundy's voice. Here Billy rose, bubbling with excitement. "This isn't the same person," he exclaimed. "Why, he was a little man, and she's a tall woman, and his hair was short, and just look at hers. You can't grow a head of hair like that in 20 minutes. "No," Angelina agreed suavely. "I wish you could." "The objection is not relevant, Mr. Pelly," said the coroner, suppressing a smile. "We are not concerned with the identity of Mr. Bundy, but with that of Angelina Frood. Can anyone identify this lady?" "I can," said I. "I swear that she is Angelina Frood." "And Mrs. Gillow?" Mrs. Gillow could and did identify her late lodger, and furthermore burst into tears and filled the courtroom with whoops of hysterical joy. When she had been pacified and gently restrained by the coroner's officer from an attempt to embrace the witness, the coroner proceeded. "Now, Mrs. Frood, the jury requires certain explanations from you in regard to the body of a woman which is at present lying in the mortuary, and which was found buried in the city wall with certain articles of clothing and jewelry which had been identified as your property. Did you know that the body had been buried in the wall?" "Yes," replied Angelina. "Did you know how it came to be in the wall?" "Yes, I put it there." "You put it there!" roared Billy amidst a chorus of exclamations from the jurymen. The coroner held up his hand to enjoin silence and asked, as he gazed in astonishment at Angelina, "Can you tell us who this deceased person was?" "I'm afraid I can't," Angelina replied apologetically. "I don't think her name was known." "But, the astounded coroner inquired, "how did she come by her death?" "I'm afraid I can't tell you that either," replied Angelina. "The fact is, I never asked." "You never asked?" the coroner repeated in a tone of bewilderment. "But, are we to understand that, in short, did you or did you not cause the death of this person by your own act?" "Of course," he added hastily. "You're not bound to answer that question." Angelina smiled at him engagingly. "I will answer with pleasure. I did not cause the death of this person." "Then are we to understand that she was already dead when you found her?" "I didn't find her. I bought her at a shop in Great St. Andrew Street. I gave £4 14 and 3 pence for her, including 2 and 3 pence to Carter Patterson's. I've brought the bill with me." She produced the bill from her pocket and handed it to the coroner, who read it with a portentous frown and a perceptible twitching at the corners of his mouth. "I will read this document to you, gentlemen," he said in a slightly unsteady voice. "It is dated the 19th of April and reads, 'Bought of Oscar Hammerstein, dealer in human and comparative osteology, Great St. Andrew Street, London, W.C. One complete set of superfine human osteology, disarticulated and unbleached, female, as selected by purchaser, £4 8 shillings and 6 pence. Replacing and cementing missing teeth, 1 shilling and 6 pence. Packing case, 2 shillings. Carriage, 2 and 3 pence. Total, £4 14 and 3 pence. Received with thanks, O. Hammerstein.' Perhaps you would like to see the bill yourselves, gentlemen?" He passed it to the foreman, taking a quick glance out of the corners of his eyes at the bland and impassive Angelina, and the jury studied it in a deep silence, which was broken only by a soft gurgling sound from somewhere behind me, which I discovered on looking round to proceed from Sergeant Carbeldick, whose crimson face was partly hidden by a large handkerchief and whose shoulders moved convulsively. Presently the coroner addressed Thorndyke. "In continuation of your evidence, Doctor, does Mrs. Frood's explanation agree with any conclusions that you had arrived at from your inspection of the remains?" "It agrees with them completely," Thorndyke replied with a grim smile. The coroner entered the answer in the depositions and then turned once more to Angelina. "With regards to the objects that were found with the skeleton, did you put them there?" "Yes. I put in the metal things and a few pieces of scorched rag to give a realistic effect. An account of the lime, you know. And the articles that were recovered from the river too, I suppose?" "Yes. I put them down, with proper precautions, of course." "What do you mean by proper precautions?" "Well, I couldn't afford to waste any of the things, so I used to keep a lookout with a telescope, and then when I saw a likely person coming along, I put one of the things down where it could be seen." "And were they always seen?" "No. Some people are very unobservant. In that case, I picked it up when the coast was clear and saved it for another time. The coroner chuckled. It was all very ingenious and complete. But now, Mrs. Frood, we have to ask you what was the object of these extraordinary proceedings? It was not a joke, I presume? Oh, not at all, replied Angelina. It was a perfectly serious affair. You have heard what sort of husband I had. I couldn't possibly live with him. I made several attempts to get away and live by myself, but he always followed me and found me out. So I determined to disappear altogether. You could have applied for a separation, said the coroner. I shouldn't have got it, replied Angelina, and even if I had, of what use would it have been? I should have been bound to him for life. I couldn't have married anyone else. My whole life would have been spoilt. So I decided to disappear completely and for good, and start life afresh in a new place and under a new name. And in order that there should be no mistake about it, I thought I would leave the material for a coroner's inquest and a will directing that a suitable monument should be put up over my grave. Then, if I had ever married again, there would have been no danger of a charge of bigamy. If anyone had made any such suggestion, I could have referred them to the registrar of deaths and to the tombstone of Angelina Frood in Rochester churchyard. And as to the birth certificate under a new name, the coroner asked with a twinkle of his eye. Angelina smiled a prim little smile. I think that could have been managed, she said. Well, said the coroner, it was an ingenious scheme. But apparently Dr. Thorndyke knew who Mr. Bundy was. How do you suppose he discovered your identity? That is just what I should like to know, she replied. So should I, said the coroner with a broad smile. But of course, it isn't my affair or that of the jury. We are concerned with the skeleton that you have planted on us. I suppose you can give us no idea as to where it came from originally? The dealer said it had been found in a barrow. Not a wheelbarrow, you know, an ancient burial place. Of course, I don't know whether he was speaking the truth. What do you think, Dr. Thorndyke? The coroner asked. I think it is an ancient skeleton, though very well preserved. Some of the teeth, the original ones, show more wear than one expects to find in a modern skull. But I only made a cursory inspection. I think the evidence is sufficient for a purpose, said the coroner. And that really concludes the case. So we need not detain you any longer, Mrs. Frood. I don't know exactly what your legal position is, whether you have committed any legal offense. If you have, it's not our business. And I think I'm expressing the sentiments of the jury if I say that I hope that the authorities will not make it their business. No one has been injured, and no action seems to be called for. With these sentiments, the jury concurred warmly, as also did Sergeant Cobbledick, who was heard very audibly and regardless of the proprieties to murmur, "Hear, hear." We waited to learn the nature of the verdict, and when this had been pronounced to the effect that the skeleton was that of an unknown woman, concerning the circumstances of whose death no evidence was available, the court rose and we prepared to depart. You are coming back to lunch with us, Angelina, said I. I should love to, she replied. But there is Mr. Japp. Do you think you could ask him to? Of course, I replied with a sudden perception of the advantage of even numbers. We shouldn't be complete without him. Japp accepted with enthusiasm, and after a hasty farewell to Cobbledick, we went forth into the High Street, by no means unobserved of the populace. As we approached the neighbourhood of the office, Angelina said, I must run into my rooms for a few moments just to tidy myself up a little. It was such a very hurried toilet. I won't be more than a few minutes. You needn't wait for me. I suggest, said Thorndyke, that Mr. Japp and I go and break the news to Mrs. Dunk that there is a lady guest, and that Strangeways remains behind to escort the prisoner. I fell in readily with this admirable suggestion, and as the two men walked on, I followed Angelina up the steps and waited while she plied a latchkey. We entered the hall together and then went into the sitting room, where she stood for a moment, looking round with deep satisfaction. It's nice to be home again, she said, and to feel that all that fuss is over. I dare say it is, said I. But now that you are home, what have you got to say for yourself? You're a nice little baggage, aren't you? I'm a little beast, John, she replied. I've been a perfect pig to you. But I didn't mean to be, and I really couldn't help it. You will try to forgive me, won't you? The fact is, Angelina, I said, I'm afraid I'm in love with you. Oh, I hope to goodness you are, John, she exclaimed. If I thought you weren't, I should wish myself a skeleton again. Do you think you really are? She crept closer to me with such a sweet, wheedlesome air that I suddenly caught her in my arms and kissed her. It does seem as if you were, she admitted with a roguish smile. And then, such unaccountable creatures of women. She laid her head on my shoulder and began to sob. But this was only a passing shower. Another kiss brought back the sunshine, and then she tripped away to spread fresh entanglements for the masculine heart. In a few minutes she returned, further adorned and looking to my eyes the very picture of womanly sweetness and grace. When I had given confirmatory evidence of my sentiments towards her, we went out just in time to encounter Mrs. Kilo and acquaint her with the program. I suppose, said Angelina, glancing furtively at a little party of women who were glancing not at all furtively at her, one should be gratified at the interest shown by one's fellow townspeople. But don't you think the back streets would be preferable to the high street? It's no use, my dear, I replied. We have got to face it. Take no notice. Regard these bipeds that infest the footways as mere samples of the local fauna. Let them stare and ignore them. For my part, I rather like them. They impress on me the admirable bargain that I have made in swapping Peter Bundy for a beautiful lady. Poor Peter, she said pensively. He was a sad boy sometimes when he looked at his big, handsome John and thought that mere friendship was all that he could hope for when his poor little heart was starving for love. Your deal isn't the only successful one, John, so you needn't be conceited. But here we are home, really home this time. For this has been my real home, John dear. And there, oh Moses, there is Mrs. Dunk waiting to receive us. What used you to do to Mrs. Dunk, I asked, to make her so furious? I only used to inquire after her health, Angelina replied plaintively. But mum's the word. She'll spot my voice as soon as I speak. Mrs. Dunk held the door open ceremoniously and curtsied as we entered. She was a gruff old woman, but she had a deep respect for gentlefolk, as is apt to be the way with old servants. Angelina acknowledged her salutation with a gracious smile and followed her meekly up the stairs to the room that Mrs. Dunk had allotted to her. I found Thorndyke and Japp established in the library. Dr. Partridge had dispensed with the drawing-room, and I followed his excellent example. And here presently Angelina joined us, sailing majestically into the room and marching up to Thorndyke with an air at once hostile and defiant. Serpent, said Angelina. Not at all, Thorndyke dissented with a smile. You should be grateful to me for having rescued you from your own barbed wire entanglements. Serpent, I repeat, persisted Angelina, to let me sit in that courtroom watching all the innocents walking into my trap one after another. And then, just as I thought they were all in sight, to hand me a thing like that. And she produced dramatically a small sheet of paper which I recognized as a reminder of Thorndyke's note. I took it from her and read, You see whither the evidence is leading. The deception cannot be maintained, nor is there any need now that your husband is dead. Explanations must be given either by you or by me. For your own sake, I urge you to explain everything and clear yourself. Let me know what you will do. This is an extraordinary document, I said, passing it to Japp. How in the name of fortune did you know that Bundy was Angelina? Yes, how did you? The latter demanded. It is for you to give an explanation now. We will have the explanations after lunch, said he. Mutual explanations. I want to hear how far I was correct in details. Very well, agreed Angelina. We will both explain. But you will have the first innings. You're not going to listen to my explanation and then say you knew all about it. And that reminds me, John, that you had better tell Mrs. Dunk. She is sure to recognize my voice. I quite agreed with Angelina and hurried away to intercept Mrs. Dunk and let her know the position. She was at first decidedly shocked, but a vivid and detailed description of the late Mr. Frood produced a complete revulsion. So complete, in fact, as to lead me to speculate on the personal characteristics of the late Mr. Dunk. But her curiosity was aroused to such an extent that, while waiting at table, she hardly removed her eyes from Angelina until the latter, finding the scrutiny unbearable, suddenly produced the hated eyeglass and sticking it in her eye, directed a stern glance at the old woman, who instantly backed towards the door with a growl of alarm and then sniggered hoarsely. It was a festive occasion, for we were all in exuberant spirits, including Mr. Japp, who, if he said little, made up the deficiency in smiles of 40 wrinkled power, which, together with his upstanding tuft of white hair, made him look like a convivial cockatoo. "Do you remember our last meeting at this table?" said Angelina, when I jeered at the famous expert and pulled his reverend leg, thinking what a smart young fellow I was, and how beautifully I was bamboozling him. And all the while he knew, and not a word said the hard-boiled egg. "Oh, serpent, serpent!" Thorndyke chuckled. "You didn't leave the hard-boiled egg much to say," he observed. "No, but why were you so secret? Why didn't you let on just a little to give poor Bundy a hint as to where he was plunging?" "My dear Mrs. Frood—" "Oh, call me Angelina," she interrupted. "Thank you," he said. "Well, my dear Angelina, you are forgetting that I didn't know what was in the wall." "My goodness!" she exclaimed. "I'd overlooked that. Of course it might have been— Good gracious, how awful!" She paused with her eyes fixed on Thorndyke, and then asked, "Supposing it had been?" "I refuse to suppose anything of the kind," he replied. "My explanations will deal with the actual, not with the hypothetical." There was silence for a minute or two. Like Angelina, I was speculating on what Thorndyke would have done if the remains had been real remains, and those of a man. He had evidently sympathized warmly with the hunted wife. But if her defense had taken the form of a crime, would he have exposed her? It was useless to ask him. I've often thought about it since, but have never reached a conclusion. "You'll have to answer questions better than that presently," said Angelina. "But I won't ask you any more now. You shall finish your lunch in peace, and then into the witness box you go. I'm going to have satisfaction for that note." The little festival went on unhurried, with an abundance of cheerful and rather frivolous talk. But at last, like all fugitive things, it came to an end. The table was cleared and garnished with the port decanter and the coffee service, and Mrs. Dunk, with the final glower, half defiant and half admiring at Angelina, took her departure. "Now," said Angelina, as I poured out the coffee, "the time has come to talk of many things, but especially of expert investigations into the identity of Peter Bundy. Your lead, sir." The end of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Mystery of Angelina Frood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Mystery of Angelina Frood by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 19. Explanations. The investigation of this case, Thorndyke began, falls naturally into two separate inquiries, that relating to the crime and that which is concerned with what we may conveniently call the personation. They make certain contacts, but they are best considered separately. Let us begin with the crime. Now, to a person having experience of real crime, there was in this case from the very beginning something rather abnormal. A woman of good social position had disappeared. There was a suggestion that she had been murdered, and the murder had apparently been committed in some public place, that is to say, not in a house. But in such cases, normally the first evidence of the crime is furnished by the discovery of the body. It is true that in this case there was a suggestion that the body had been flung into the river, and this at first masked the abnormality to some extent. But even then there was the discrepancy that the brooch, which was attached to the person, appeared to have been found on land, while the bag, which was not attached to the person, was picked up at the water's edge. The bag itself and the box which had been in it presented several inconsistencies. They had apparently been lying unnoticed for 11 days on a piece of shore that was crowded with small craft and frequently by numbers of seamen and labourers, and that formed a playground for the waterside children. The clean state of the box when found showed that it had neither been handled nor immersed, and as the wrapping paper was intact, the person who had taken it out of the bag must have thrown it away without opening it to see what it contained. The bag was found under some light rubbish. That rubbish had not been thrown on it by the water, or the bag would have been soaked, or no one could have thrown the rubbish on it without seeing the bag, which was an article of some value. Again, the bag had not been carried to this place by the water, as was proved by its condition. Therefore, either this was a place where the crime had been committed, or someone had brought the bag to this place and thrown it away. But neither supposition was reasonably probable. It was inconceivable that a person like Mrs. Frood should have been in this remote, inaccessible, disreputable place at such an hour. The bag could not have been brought here by an innocent person, for no such person would have thrown it away. It was quite a valuable bag, and a guilty person would have thrown it in the river, and probably put a stone in it to sink it. So you see that these first clues were strikingly abnormal. They prepared one to consider the possibility of false tracks. Even the brooch incident had a faint suggestion of the same kind when considered with the other clues. The man who pawned the brooch had a mole on his nose. Such an adornment can be easily produced artificially. It's highly distinctive of the person who possesses it, and it is equally distinctive, negatively, of the person who does not possess it. Then there was the character of the person who had disappeared. She was a woman who was seeking to escape from a husband, and hitherto she had not succeeded because she had not hidden herself securely enough. She was a person of a somewhat disappearing tendency. She had an understandable motive for disappearing. From the very beginning, therefore, the possibility of voluntary disappearance had to be borne in mind. And when it was, each new clue seemed to support it. There was a scarf, for instance. It was found under a fish trunk, an unlikely place for it to have got by chance, but an excellent one for a plant. The scarf was not boldly exposed, but someone was sure to turn the trunk over and find it. And at this point, another peculiarity began to develop. There was a noticeable tendency for the successive finds to creep up the river from Chatham towards Rochester Bridge. It was not yet very remarkable, but I noticed it as I entered each find on my map. The brooch was associated with Chatham, the bag and box with the Chatham shore a little farther up, the scarf with the Rochester shore at Blue Boar Head. As I say, it attracted my attention. And when the first shoe was found above Blue Boar Head, the second shoe farther up still, and the hat pin yet farther up towards the bridge, it became impossible to ignore it. There was no natural explanation. Whether the body was floating or stationary, the constancy of direction was inexplicable. For the tide sweeps up and down twice daily, and the objects detached from the body would be carried up or downstream according to the direction of the tide when they become detached. This regular order was a most suspicious circumstance. Later, when the objects were found in Black Boy Lane, it became absurd. It was a mere paper chase. Just look at my map. He exhibited the large-scale map on which each find was marked by a small circle. The series of circles, joined by a connecting line, proceeded directly from near Sun Pier, Chatham, along the shore, and up Black Boy Lane to the gate of the waste ground and across it to the wall. Angelina giggled. "You can't say I didn't make it as easy as I could for poor old Gobbledick," she said. "Of course, I never reckoned on anyone bringing up the heavy guns. By the way, I wonder who your private client was. Do you know John?" she added, with a sudden glance of suspicion. And as I grinned sheepishly, she exclaimed, "Well, I wouldn't have believed it. It was a regular conspiracy. But I am interrupting the expert. Proceed, my lord." "Well," Thorndyke resumed, "we have considered the aspect of the crime problem taken by itself as it appeared to an experienced investigator. From the first, there was a suspicion that the clues were counterfeit, and with each new clue, this suspicion deepened. And you will notice an important corollary. If the case was a fraud, that fraud was being worked by someone on the spot. Keep that point in mind, for it has a most significant bearing on the other problem, that of the personation, to which we will now turn our attention. But before we go into details, there are certain general considerations that we ought to note in order that we may understand more clearly how the deception became possible. The subject of personation and disguise is often misunderstood. It's apt to be supposed that a disguise effects a complete transformation, resulting in a complete resemblance to the individual personated, or, as in this case, a complete disappearance of the identity of the disguised person. But no such transformation is possible. All disguise is a form of bluff. It acts by suggestion, and the suggestion is effected by a set of misleading circumstances which produce in the dupe a state of mind in which a very imperfect disguise serves to produce conviction. That is the psychology of personation, and I can only express my admiration of the way in which Angelina had grasped it. Her conduct of this delicate deception was really masterly. Let us consider it in more detail. Mr. Bundy was ostensibly a man, but if he had been put in a room with a dozen moderately intelligent persons, and those persons had been asked, "Is this individual a man, or is he a woman with short hair and dressed in man's clothing?" they would probably have decided unanimously that he was a woman. But the question never was asked. The question was never raised. He was Mr. Bundy. One doesn't look at young men to see if they are women in disguise. Then consider the position of Strangeways, the chosen victim. He comes to a strange town to transact business with a firm of land agents. He goes into the office and finds the partners, whose names are on the plate outside, and to whom he has been sent by his London agent, engaged in their normal avocations. He transacts his business with them in a normal way, and Mr. Bundy seems to be an ordinary, capable young man. He goes back later and interviews Mr. Bundy, who is just on the point of taking him to introduce him to Mrs. Frood, when he is called away. Then within a few minutes he is taken to Mrs. Frood's house, where he finds that lady calmly engaged in needlework. Supposing Mrs. Frood had been extremely like Bundy, could it possibly have entered Strangeways' head that they might be one and the same person? Remember that he had left Bundy in another place only a few minutes before, and here was Mrs. Frood in her own apartments with the appearance of having been there for hours. Obviously no such thought could have occurred to any man. There was nothing to suggest it. But in fact, Angelina was not perceptibly like Bundy on cursory inspection. They were markedly different in size. A woman always looks bigger than a man of the same height. Bundy was a little man and looked smaller than he was by the reason of his very low heels. Angelina was a biggish woman and looked taller than she was by reason of her high heels and her hair. Disregarding her hair, she was fully 2 inches taller than Bundy. Then the facial resemblance must have been slight. Angelina had a mass of hair and wore it low down on her brows and temples. Bundy's hair was short and was brushed back from his forehead. Angelina had strong black eyebrows. Bundy's eyebrows were thin, or rather cut off short. Angelina was pale, careworn, dark under the eyes, with drooping mouth, melancholy expression, and depressed in manner. Bundy was fresh-coloured, smiling, gay, and sprightly in manner, and he wore an eyeglass, which has a surprising effect on facial expression. Their voices and intonation were strikingly different. Finally, Strangeways never saw Angelina excepting in a very subdued light in which any small resemblances in features would be unnoticeable. And now observe another effect of suggestion. Strangeways had made the acquaintance of Mr. Bundy. Then he had made the acquaintance of Mrs. Frood. They were two separate persons. They were practically strangers to one another. They belonged to different sets of surroundings. He would never think of them in connection with one another. They were two of his friends, mutually unacquainted. In this condition of separateness, they would become established in his mind, and the conception of them as different persons would become confirmed by habit. It would be a permanent suggestion that would offer an obstacle to any future suggestion that they were the same. That was the advantage of introducing Bundy first, for if he had appeared only after Angelina had disappeared, there would have been no such opposing suggestion. The resemblances might have been noticed, and he might have been detected. In passing, I may remark upon the tact and judgment that were shown in the disguise. The troublesome makeup, the wig, the false eyebrows, the greased paint, the false voice, all were concentrated on the temporary Mrs. Frood, who was to disappear. Bundy was not disguised at all, excepting for the eyeglass. He was simply Angelina, with a hair cut short and dressed as a man. He hadn't even an assumed voice, for as Angelina is a contralto and habitually speaks in the lower register, her voice would pass quite well as a high tenor, so long as she kept off the head notes. So much for the general aspects of the case. And now as to my own position. As I had never seen Angelina, I naturally should not perceive any resemblance to her in Bundy. But equally with Strangeways, I was subject to the suggestion that Bundy was a man. The personal equation, however, was different. It is my professional habit to reject all mental suggestion so far as is possible, to sift out the facts and consider them with an open mind regardless of what they appear to suggest. And then you are to remember that when I first met Mr. Bundy, there was already in my mind a faint suspicion that this was not a genuine crime, that things were not quite what they appeared. And if this were the case, the clues were being manipulated by somebody on the spot. When I met Bundy, I looked him over as I look every person whom I meet for the first time. And that inspection yielded one or two rather remarkable facts. I noticed that he wore exceptionally low heels and that he had several physical characteristics that were distinctly feminine. The very low heels puzzled me somewhat. If they had been exceptionally high, there would have been nothing in it. But why would a noticeably short man wear almost abnormally low heels? I could think of no reason unless he wore them for greater comfort, but I noted the fact and reserved it for further consideration. Of his physical peculiarities, the first that attracted my attention was the shape of his hands. They were quite of the feminine type. Of course, hands vary, but still it was a fact to be noted, and the observation caused me to look him over a little more critically, and then I discovered a number of other feminine characteristics. Perhaps it may be useful to consider briefly the less obvious differences between the sexes. The more obvious ones would of course be provided for by the disguise. There are two principal groups of such differences. The one has reference to the distribution of bulk, the other to the direction of certain lines. Let us take the distribution of bulk. This exhibits opposite tendencies in the two sexes. In the female, the great mass is central, the hip region, and from this the form diminishes in both directions. The whole figure, including the arms, is contained in an elongated ellipse, and the tendency affects the individual members. The limbs are bulky where they join the trunk. They taper pretty regularly towards the extremities, and they terminate in relatively small hands and feet. The hands themselves taper as a whole, and the individual fingers taper markedly from a comparatively thick base to a pointed tip. In the male figure, the opposite condition prevails. It tends to be acromegalous. The central mass is relatively small, the peripheral masses is relatively large. The hip region is narrow, and there is a great widening towards the shoulders. The limbs taper much less towards the extremities, and they terminate in relatively large hands and feet. So too with the hands. They tend to be square in shape, and the individual fingers, excepting the index finger, are nearly as broad at the tips as at the base. Of the second group of differences, we need consider only one or two instances. The general rule is that certain contour lines tend in the male to be vertical or horizontal in direction, and in the female to be oblique. A man's neck at the back is nearly straight and vertical. A woman's shows a sweeping oblique curve. The angle of a man's lower jaw is nearly a right angle. There is a vertical and horizontal ramus. A woman's lower jaw has an open angle, and its contour forms an oblique line from the ear to the chin. But the most distinctive difference is in the ear itself. A man's ear has its long diameter vertical. A woman's has a long diameter oblique. The obliquity is usually very marked. Bearing these differences in mind and remembering that they are subject to variations in individual cases, let us now return to Mr. Bundy. His hands, as I have said, had the feminine character. His feet were small even for a small man. His ears were set obliquely, and the line of his jaw was oblique with an open angle. His shoulders had evidently been made up by the tailor, and he seemed rather wide across the hips for a man. In short, all those bodily characteristics which were not concealed or disguised by the clothing were feminine. It was rather a remarkable fact. So much so that I began to ask myself if it were possible that he might actually be a woman in disguise. I watched him narrowly. There was nothing distinctive in his walk, but there was in the movements of the arms. He flourished his stick jauntily enough, but he had not that nice conduct of a clouded cane. That is as much a social gadget in our day as it was in the days of good Queen Anne. It needs a skill born of years of practice to manage a stick properly, as one realizes when one sees the working man taking his malacca for its Sunday morning walk. Mr. Bundy had not that skill. His stick was a thing consciously carried. It was not a part of himself. Then the movement of the free arm was feminine. When a woman swings her arm, she swings it through a large arc, especially in the backward direction, probably to avoid a hip, and the palm of the hand tends to be turned backward. A man's free arm either hangs motionless or swings slightly unless he is walking very fast. It swings principally forward, and the palm of his hand inclines inwards. These are small matters, but their cumulative significance is great. Further, there was a mental habit. Bundy was jocose and playfully ironic. But a gentleman of 25 doesn't pull the leg of a gentleman of 50 whom he knows but slightly, whereas a lady of 25 does. And very properly, he added, seeing that Angelina had turned rather pink, that is a compliment in a young lady which would be an impertinence in a young man. No doubt when the equality of the sexes is an accomplished fact, things will be different. It will never be an accomplished fact, said Angelina. The equality of the sexes is like the equality of the classes. The people who roar for social equality are the underdogs, and the women who shout for sex equality are the undercats. Normal women are satisfied with things as they are. Hearken unto the wisdom of Angelina, said Thorndyke with a smile. But perhaps she is right. It may be that the women who are so eager to compete with men are those who can't compete with women. I can't say. I have never been a woman. Whereas Angelina has the advantage of being able to view the question from both sides. The prima facie evidence then suggested that Mr. Bundy was a woman. But as this was a prima facie improbability, the matter had to be gone into further. On Mr. Bundy's cheeks and chin was a faint blue coloration, suggestive of such a growth of whiskers and beard as would be appropriate to his age. Now, if those whiskers and that beard were genuine, the other signs were fallacious. Mr. Bundy must be a man. But his cheeks looked perfectly smooth and clean, and it was about 7 o'clock in the evening. My own cheeks, in strange ways, were by this time visibly prickly, and as he had been with us all day, Mr. Bundy could not have shaved since the morning. I tried vainly to get a closer view and was considering how it could be managed when Providence intervened. I know, said Angelina. It was that beastly mosquito. Yes, agreed Thorndyke. But even then I could not get a chance to look at the skin closely. But when we got Mr. Bundy into the surgery and examined the bite through a lens, the murder was out. You could see that there was no whiskers, said Angelina. It wasn't that, replied Thorndyke. It was something much more conclusive. You may know that the whole of the human body, excepting the palms of the hands and soles of the feet and the eyelids, is covered with a fine down, technically called the lanugo. It consists of minute, nearly colorless hairs set quite closely together, and may be seen as a sort of halo on the face of a woman or child when the edge of the contour is against the light. On the face of a clean-shaved man it is, of course, absent, as it is shaved off with the whiskers. Now on Mr. Bundy's face the lanugo was intact all over the blue area. It followed that he had never been shaved. It further followed that the blue coloration was an artificial stain. But this made it practically a certainty that Mr. Bundy was a woman. The question now was, if Bundy was a woman, what woman was he? The obvious answer seemed to be Angelina Frood. She was missing. But if the disappearance was an imposture, someone on the spot was planting the clues. That someone would most probably be Mrs. Frood herself. But if she were lurking in the neighborhood, she must be disguised. And here was a disguised woman. Nevertheless, obvious as her suggestion was, the thing suggested seemed to be impossible. Strangeways knew both Angelina and Bundy, and he had not recognized the latter. And I had a vague impression that he had seen them together, which of course would absolutely exclude their identity. A little judicious conversation with him, however, showed that neither objection had any weight. He had never seen them both at any time, and his description of Mrs. Frood made it clear that she had appeared to him totally unlike Bundy. The next thing was to ascertain definitely if this woman really was Mrs. Frood, and fortunately I had the means of making a very simple test. Strangeways had given me a photograph of Angelina bearing the address of a theatrical photographer, and from him I obtained 7 different photographs in various poses. Then I received from Strangeways a group photograph that was taken of us by the city wall, which contained an excellent portrait of Mr. Bundy. Out of this photograph I cut a small square containing Bundy's head, soaked it in oil of bergamot, and mounted it in Canada balsam in a glass plate. This made the paper quite transparent, so I now had transparent positive. I selected from the photographs of Angelina one that was in a pose exactly similar to the portrait of Bundy, practically full face, and treated it in the same way. Then I handed the 2 transparencies to my assistant, and he, by means of a big copying camera, produced 2 life-size negatives exactly alike in dimensions. With prints from these negatives, we were able to perform some experiments. From Angelina's portrait, I carefully cut out the face, leaving the hair and neck, and slipped Bundy's portrait behind it, so that his face appeared through the hole. We could now see how Bundy looked with Angelina's hair, and on putting it beside an untouched portrait of Angelina, it was obvious, in spite of the eyeglass, that it was the same face. For you must remember that the Angelina that we had was a real person, not the made-up Angelina whom Strangeways had seen. This success encouraged us to take a little more trouble. My man Polton made some black paper masks with the aid of which he produced two composite photographs, one of which had Bundy's face and Angelina's hair, neck and bust, while the other had Angelina's face and Bundy's hair, forehead, neck and bust. The eyeglass was the disturbing factor, though it showed very little, and Bundy managed it so skillfully that it hardly affected the shape of the eye and the set of the brow. Still, it was necessary to eliminate it, and as painting was out of our province, we invoked the aid of Mrs. Anstey, who is a very talented portrait painter and a miniaturist. She touched out the joints in the composites, painted out the eyeglass in the one, and painted an eyeglass into the other, and now the identity was complete. The Bundy-Angelina portrait was identical with the photographer's portrait, and the Angelina Bundy photograph was Mr. Bundy to the life. However, we made a final test. Polton reduced the Bundy-Angelina portrait to cabinet size and made a couple of carbon prints, which I brought down here and exhibited. And as Strangeways accepted them as portraits of Angelina, I considered the proof complete. Here Angelina interrupted. "But what about the brooch? I never had a brooch like that." Thorndyke smiled a grim smile. "I asked Mrs. Anstey to paint in a brooch of a characteristic design." "What for?" asked Angelina. "Ah," said Thorndyke, "thereby hangs a tail." "Oh, a serpent's tail, I suppose," said Angelina. "You will be able to judge presently," he replied. "The brooch had its uses." Well, to continue. The identity of Mr. Bundy was now established as a moral certainty, but it was not certain enough for legal purposes. I wanted conclusive evidence, and I wanted to ascertain exactly how the transformation effects were worked. I had noted that Bundy and Angelina occupied adjoining houses, which were virtually the two moieties of a double house with a common covered passageway. I assumed that the two houses communicated, but it was necessary to ascertain if they really did. The only way to establish the fact was to inspect the house in which Angelina had lived, and this I determined to do in the very faint hope that I might be able at the same time to get one or more of Angelina's fingerprints. I made a pretext for visiting the house with Strangeways, and we had the extraordinary good luck to find Mrs. Gillows just going out, so we had the house to ourselves. But this was not the only piece of luck, for we found that Angelina had taken a drink from the bedroom tumbler and water bottle before going out, and had left on them a complete set of beautiful fingerprints, of which I secured a number of admirable photographs. Examination of the basement showed that I was right as to the communication. Both houses had a side door opening into the passageway, and both doors were fitted with Yale latches which looked as if they were opened with the same key. The passage was little used, but the gravel between the two doors was a good deal trodden, and there were numerous fingerprints on Angelina's side door. In the kitchen was a large cupboard fitted with a Yale lock on the door and pegs inside. I assumed that when Angelina was at home, that cupboard contained a suit of Mr. Bundy's clothes, and that when Mr. Bundy was in the office, it contained a wig and a dress and a pair of ladies' shoes. Well, that made the evidence fairly complete, with one exception. We had to get a set of Bundy's fingerprints to compare with Angelina's. That was where the brooch came in. I knew that when Mr. Bundy saw a portrait of his former self with a brooch that he had never possessed, his curiosity would be aroused, and he would examine that portrait closely. And so he did. And on my asking him to compare the two prints, he took the opportunity to pick them both up, one in each hand, to scrutinize them more minutely and find out who the photographer was. When he put them down, they bore a complete, though invisible, set of his fingerprints. Later, Mr. Bundy went home, escorted by Strangeways. As soon as they were gone, I took the photographs up to my room, developed up the fingerprints with powder, and compared them minutely, line by line, with the photograph of those on the tumbler and the bottle. They were identical. The fingerprints of Bundy were the fingerprints of Angelina Frood. That completed the case. And if I had known what Angelina's intentions were, I should have notified Bundy that the game was up. But I was in the dark. I could do nothing until I knew whether she was going to produce a body, and if so, whose body it would be. The city wall was in my mind as a possibility, since I had noticed the curious disappearance of the gate key on that significant date, and I had heard the story of the bill, the bargee, and knew that Bundy had heard it and apparently taken it seriously. But one can't act on conjecture. I could only watch Angelina play a game and try to follow the moose. When the paper chase turned up Black Boy Lane, I knew that the wall burial was intended to be discovered. But I didn't know what was in the wall, and I may say that I was rather alarmed. For if Angelina had taken the story of Bill as a reliable precedent and had buried a real body in quicklime, there was going to be a catastrophe. It was an immense relief to me when I got Strangeway's report that only a skeleton had been found, for I knew then that only a skeleton had been buried and that no crime had been committed. That's all I have to tell. And now it is Angelina's turn to enter the confessional. You haven't left me much to tell, said Angelina. I feel as if I had been doing the thimble and pea trick with glass thimbles. However, I will fill in a few details. The scheme first occurred to me when I came down here to take over the property that had been left to me. I put it confidentially to Uncle Jap, but he was so shocked that he has never been able to get his head to lie down since. He wouldn't hear of it. So I asked him to lunch with poor Nicholas. And after that, he was ready to agree to anything. Accordingly, I made my preparations. I got a theatrical wig maker to cut off my hair and make it into a wig. I told him I had a man's part and it was expected to be a long run. Got a suit made by a theatrical costumer, and down I came as Mr. Bundy. Uncle J had already had the new plate put up. The next two offices and basement were empty, so we got them furnished by Angelina, and as soon as the wig was ready, down she came and took possession. Up to this time, the third act was a bit sketchy. I had arranged the disappearance and the recovery of the clues from the river, and I had a plan of buying a mummy, dressing it in my clothes, and burying it in the marshes close to the shore, where I could discover it when it had matured sufficiently. But I didn't much like the plan. I didn't know enough about mummies, and some other people might know too much. It looked as if I should have to do without a body and leave my death to mere rumour, which would be unsatisfactory. I did want a tombstone. About this time, an angel of the name of Percival, he lives in Adam and Eve Street, Adelphi, bless him, sent a Dr. Strangeways down here. He was a regular windfall, a new doctor, and I gave him my entire attention. I took him to his own proposed premises and kept him in conversation to let my personality soak well in. That evening I interviewed him in the office and let him suppose that I was going to take him to Mrs. Frood's house and introduce him to her. Then, when I suddenly remembered an engagement elsewhere, I went out, and as soon as the office door was shut, down I darted into our basement, out at the side door, in at the other side door, and into Mrs. Frood's kitchen. There I did a lightning change, slipped on my dress and wig, stuck on my eyebrows, and made up my complexion, flew up the stairs, lighted the lamp in the sitting room, and spread myself out with my needlework. But I hadn't been settled more than 2 or 3 minutes when Uncle Jap arrived, leading the lamb to the slaughter. Then it turned out that I had struck a bit of luck that I hadn't bargained for. John had attended me in London and knew something of my affairs, so I appointed him my physician in ordinary on the spot. It was rare sport. The concern poor old John showed for my grease paint was quite touching. I said their squeaking complaints to him and receiving his sympathy until I was ready to screech with laughter. But I felt rather a pig all the same, for John was so sweet, and he was such a man and such a gentleman. However, I had to go on when once I had begun. But it was a troublesome business, worse than any stage job I ever had to keep these two people going. I had to rush through from the office into the kitchen and cook things that I did not want, just to make a noise and a smell of cooking, and listen to Mrs. Gillow so that I could pop up the stairs at the psychological moment and remind her that I lived there, and then to fly down and change and dart through into the office so that people could see that I was occupied there. It was frightfully hard work, and anxious too. I can tell you it was a relief when I heard from Miss Cumbers that Nicholas was starting for Brighton, and that I could disappear without implicating him. However, there is no need for me to go into any more details. Your imaginations can fill those in. The man with the mole, I take it, said Thorndyke, was? Yes, I got a suit of slops in the Minories. The mole, of course, was built up with topi paste. By the way, said Thorndyke, was there any necessity for Bundy at all? Well, I had to be somebody, you know, and I had to stay on the spot to work the clues and keep an eye on the developments. I couldn't be a woman because that would have required a heavy make-up that would almost certainly have been spotted and would have been intolerable bore. Whereas Bundy, as you have pointed out, was not a disguise at all. When once I had got my hair cut and had provided myself with clothes and eyeglass, there was no further trouble. I could have lived comfortably as Bundy for the rest of my life. So that's my story, Angelina concluded, and she added with a sudden change of manner, I'm your grateful debtor forever. You have done far more for me even than you know. Only this morning poor Peter Bundy was a forlorn little wretch, miserably anxious about the present and looking to a future that had nothing but empty freedom to offer. And now I am the happiest of women, for I should be a hypocrite if I pretended to have any regrets for poor Nicholas. I will say goodbye to him in his coffin and give him a decent funeral and try to think of him as he was before he sank into the depths. But I am frankly glad that he is gone out of his own miserable life and out of mine. And his going, which would never have been known but for the wisdom of the benevolent serpent, has left me free with the promise of a happiness that even he does not guess. I am not so sure of that, said Thorndyke with a sly smile. Well, neither am I, now you come to mention it, said she, smiling at him in return. He is an inquiring and observant serpent with a way of nosing out all sorts of things that he is not supposed to be aware of. And after all, perhaps he has a right to know. It is proper that the giver should have the satisfaction of realizing the preciousness of that which he has given. Here endeth the mystery of Angelina Frood, and yet it is not quite the end. Indeed, the end is not yet, for the blessed consequences still continue to develop like the growth of a fair tree. The story has dwindled to a legend, whose harmless whispers call but a mischievous smile to that face that, like the dial in her garden, acknowledges only the sunshine. Mrs. Dunk, it is true, still wages public war, but it is tempered by private adoration, and almost daily baskets of flowers and even tomatoes and summer cabbages arrive at her house accompanied by the beaming smile and portly person of Inspector Cobbledick. The end of Chapter 19. The end of The Mystery of Angelina Frood by R. Austin Freeman.